Hi, I'm Karen Katz, author of Unto the Daughters, written as Karen Tintori, and I'm delighted to be here with Fran Shor, author of Soupy Sales and the Detroit Experience, something that I experienced as a child growing up and going home for lunch with Soupy every day.
Great.
Fran, can you describe your book to us in a sentence, please?
Yes, my book on Soupy Sales and the Detroit Experience is an effort to incorporate the life story of Soupy Sales, or Milton Sutman, as his birth name was, the role of television and popular culture in the 1950s, and the history of Detroit, the social cultural history of Detroit in the 1950s, in order to provide a kind of context and content for why Soupy Sales gained such popularity and became such a well-loved celebrity in Detroit.
Were there any books that spurred you on to become a writer?
You know, that to try to unravel how I became a writer is pretty much connected with the fact that as an academic, that's assumed that one of the things you'll be able to do, and one of the privileges we academics have, is taking the time to investigate a lot of different subjects. And most of the things I've written are very heavy topics: war, racism, those sorts of things. So the departure of writing about Soupy Sales was, for me, primarily both personal, and in a way it was also an exploration of certain topics that I wanted to look at. The personal was because I had finally been able to convince my 98-year-old father to come up to Detroit, and he was in failing health, and just trying to deal with him and thinking about the long range of all the issues that I had, growing up, had been dealing with my parents. I just thought, let's go back to a time that was a pretty wonderful time, namely the time of Soupy Sales was when I was in junior high school in Pittsburgh and saw him for the first time, and thought about, well, wouldn't this be interesting to go back and look at his life, particularly in Detroit? So I didn't really know his background. I didn't know much beyond his screen presence. And there were certain things that turned up that were really amazing. Like any good writer, one has to do a lot of reading. I had to do both reading in secondary sources, things that had previously been written about television, about Detroit, etc. But I also had to do some primary resource work, which included interviewing a lot of people, probably like you, Karen, who grew up with Soupy Sales in the Detroit area and had memories that I wanted to incorporate in the book that I wrote. So in addition to those interviews, I also was able to locate a number of people who worked with Soupy Sales, and who knew him personally and were workmates with Soupy. And in addition, I had to go back through the archives of the Detroit News, the Free Press, the Jewish News, and in order to track down certain kinds of things, interviews, other elements that I incorporated into the book.
Were there any surprises or serendipitous moments that happened during researching and writing the book?
Yeah, I didn't really know that Soupy had an evening program. I mean, I think most of us who were introduced to Soupy Sales saw him in his lunchtime program, even those of us who were not Detroiters but watched on the syndicated program when it went on ABC in 1959, in the fall of 1959. So when I found out about his evening program called Soups On, which was initially a 10-minute program at 11 o'clock and then expanded to 30 minutes, not only was I surprised by it, but I was also intrigued because I'm a big jazz fan, and Soupy showcased some of the great jazz performers who would come through Detroit and perform at the various clubs around town. So I had to go back and look at the archives in the news and free press, who was appearing maybe that night, and cross-check it with a wonderful database called Concert Database to see where these performers were playing in town, whether it was at the Flame Show Bar or whether it was at Baker's Keyboard Lounge. So I was able to cross-check and get a good bead on where these performers were, who they were, trying to explain how they appeared on Soupy in the evening program. And that to me was not only a great surprise, but it was also really rewarding because, as I said, I'm a big jazz fan.
But did you encounter any writer's block while you were doing this book?
Not really. It's a book that really flowed pretty easily once I began to accumulate all the little parts that I needed, both in terms of primary and secondary sources. I would say the one thing that was always problematic, and this happens whenever anybody is writing something that has a lot of biographical content, and that is contacting the family members. And his two sons are actually rock and roll performers, Tony and Hunt. And I tried every which way to get a hold of them and was never successful. His first wife, who was with him during his time in Detroit, had passed. And I was able to make contact with his second wife, but she was somewhat guarded and understandably pretty private about what she wanted to reveal and not reveal. So I would say, those were some of the more frustrating parts of it, but I understood that as someone who, was not wanting to pry into people's private affairs, but trying to get as much of the private and public record as I could manage.
Well, hopefully they will know about the book and they'll be able to read the book. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person at Detroit Jewish Book Fair on November 13th. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you, Karen.